Hi, I'm Denny Somack. This is The Rock Podcast. I'm a rock historian, producer, and best-selling author. On The Rock Podcast, you will hear new interviews as well as classic interviews from my archives. So I went to the vaults and found this amazing conversation with Jeff Beck. Now, Jeff passed away in January of 2023. He was one of the greatest and most influential guitar players of all time. He didn't give many interviews, so this is one where he spoke extensively about the Yardbirds and his early days. It is a classic conversation, and I know you'll enjoy it.
Who were some of the people that influenced you, that you admired, that were professionals at that time? They weren't actually at school. They were out there playing, earning money.
My influences, it was a sort of chaotic jumble of 50s style rock. All sorts of things were happening. I mean, I never got Elvis Presley out of my system, really. I mean, the guitarist, Scotty Moore, from those records, that was really what knocked me over, and the early Little Richard records. And so, you're talking about 57, 58 to about 61, with that still going on in my mind, anyway. And
Very much influenced by American players.
Oh, then. Yes, always American. I used to stick glued to the radio, listening to Luxembourg, and because that was the only place they'd play a rock and roll record for a while.
Well, I mean, white blues hadn't happened really, and certainly hadn't happened in Britain at that point. So what you were doing was very much experimental, and people like Alexis Corner and Cyril Davis.
Yeah, it was just a genuine love for Negro blues and black and white rock and roll. And I didn't really see the line. I just loved music, period. I didn't care whether black or white or what. And then you start learning these things. And you find out that you narrow the field down to about 2 or 3 guitarists, and it goes on, And, when you're sort of 16 or 17, you keep going out in the streets and meeting all your friends, and you say, that's not happening anymore, this is the guy you listen to. Mm-hmm. And it was very healthy, very fertile period.
Guitars are things that, in your case, lead guitar or a bass guitarist would admire particular types of guitars played by particular types of musicians as well. Was there any instrument that yours had an inkling to buy at some point?
Well, my mother was desperate for me to learn the piano, which I didn't want to learn. I just liked listening to. It was, there's a lot of difference between actually playing an instrument and listening to somebody playing. And I couldn't get along with the piano. And I just always felt that it was such a popular instrument, everybody was playing it. And there was the average kid of 12 on our block could play Brahms and Liszt and all that sort of stuff. And I just didn't have the feel for that. But as soon as I picked up a violin and plunked around with it without the bow, I knew there was something there. And a cello, anything that you could make an unusual sound with. And it was unusual, I can tell you. And sort of bashing it with rulers and slapping it, and that was more me. I had rock and roll in the blood, from that point of view.
What sort of guitar exercises, did you practice when you started? Nowadays...
I used to ape off people like Buddy Holly, because he was a wizard guitarist. And there was a little phrase he played at the beginning of one of his records, "That'll Be the Day," that I learnt. It was a honky-tonk piano lick, but it sounded better on guitar. So I learnt that and impressed all my friends, and they said, "Hey, Beck can play the guitar," I couldn't really. I could just play that and then say, "Well, I'm not playing anymore. That's it." and then I have to go home and sweat and learn a bit more. That's how it started.
What about your contemporaries, people that were also practicing and playing in the early days too? Did you keep an eye on them and see what they were up to?
Not too much. I had very slanted views. I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and I didn't think anybody could play the drums properly. They all seemed to lack the rock feel that was so right and so eminent in all those early rock records of the 50s, of American 50s records. So I couldn't stand most English bands at that time. Then you start hearing these names, and you keep having them crammed down your throat. And once in a while you go out within sort of bus journey and see somebody playing in a village hall or town hall somewhere. And you'd come away completely blown away, not so much with the musicianship, but the fact that there they were on stage and doing what you really wanted to do. I think Lord Such and the Savages and things like that. Outrageous. And so then I had a whole lot more things to think about, stage presence, and would I be able to play once I got on stage? Could I entertain with the sort of music that I was interested in?
So once you left art school, that the object in mind was to just go pro, was it?
I just loved the feeling of being on stage. It was terrifying, but it was over in a flash. And I'd sort of be going home to where I lived in Wallington from Tunbridge on a Wednesday night, wondering what the hell happened to the evening. It was just over in a flash. And you just, the next morning, you felt great that people were dancing and screaming and clapping, and even those days, you know.
Who were the people that you played with before you joined the Yardbirds?
Oh, there were several little. I mean, bands were. It was phenomenal if a band stayed together with the same lineup for a week. In those days, we'd have to pick up different drummers because it'd be nothing for us to pick up the drummer. He'd have a row with his girlfriend, and then we'd have to pick up another drummer on the way to the gig because he, you know, stuff like that. So I played with a few local bands and found that they weren't really. Usually the drummer and the bass player were useless. Music.
So that took you through the early 60s until you joined the Yardbirds. How did you actually meet up with the band?
I was doing quite well with a band called the Tridents. I mean, that's mentioned several times in little books I've written and, you know, articles I've written in magazines, and people have come to know the Tridents almost, but there's not any recorded works apart from one demo tape that's I've got in my shelf there.
Not letting
and
go.
no, we played the 100 Club, and we were really following the steps of the Yardbirds, and the Who weren't there. They were called the High Numbers. The Stones and Yardbirds were the names that were constantly bandied around.
The Blues Breakers were there too,
Pardon?
weren't they? The Blues Breakers, John Mayall.
I didn't hear too much about them until I started going to a guitar shop and trying to do miracle deals with swapping guitars, and then they say, "Where are you going tonight? You've got to go and see John Mayall." I went, "Oh, where's he playing?" And it was too far north of London. I didn't know my way around, and I thought, "No, I'll get the train home." So I was terrible. I had to go home all the time. You know, hated going. I was like Jim Page. Couldn't stand being on the road.
So you in the Tridents followed the
That's
Yardbirds
right.
around?
That's right. And one marvellous night in the 100 Club, this hand came out and grabbed me and said, "You will be a star," you know.
Whose hand was that?
It was Hamish Grimes and George Ogomelski. They were the Yardbirds spokesman and manager, and they sort of. I thought it was going to be beaten up, because Giorgio looks a bit like Fidel Castro, you know. I thought, this is it. I'm going to be done over. What have I done? What have I done?
I should never have come.
And they
to
put
this
me up, and
great
they.
city.
I think it was a non-alcohol bar, right? And they'd slapped this plastic beaker of orange juice down and said, "Right, sit down here. We're going to talk to you." And they told me I had a chance to be in a top band, and if I was interested to be at 18 Carlisle Street, I can remember the name of the address, at 10 o'clock the next morning or the next day, I think. And I was there. And then I found out it was the Yardbirds. I was very cross because I'd been bad-mouthing the Yardbirds, only flying the flag for the Tridents because we were better than the Yardbirds. So I had to suddenly jump off one boat onto another and say, "Well, sorry, lads, the Tridents weren't really quite making it." Plus, they had a nice suit, the Yardbirds, for me, so that swung.
Did the guys in the Tridents go on to bigger and better things after that, or did they just
No,
disappear?
I'm afraid not. No, they didn't really have much going in terms of a front man. They had three brothers, and they all seemed to melt together into this non-existent sort of folk blues type of thing. I mean, they were very shy. One would sort of sing facing the back of the stage, and the other one would wander about. And I used to be quite popular because I used to run around a bit and make a few noises and a few funny faces. And when I left, they couldn't find another guitarist, so they fizzled out.
Had you actually seen the Yardbirds play?
No, I just kept hearing about it. I'd never even seen them. Even to the time when I joined, I hadn't seen them play.
So you didn't know them?
No, we've skipped a little bit where Jim Page came into the picture. He said, "Have you ever heard the Yardbirds?" And I said, "No." And he played me 5 long years off the 5 live Yardbirds album, and I just fell over. I couldn't believe it. It was so much what I wanted to do. I think that was the time when I became aware of them. And then lo and behold, a few weeks later, I'm being asked to join. And it was all because of Jim Page.
Well, Jim didn't really want to play in the band in those days because he was quite a busy session musician at that point, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think I thought he thought that his father was an advisor to him, and he said, "Son, don't do this, don't do that. You'll just be in that band, and you'll lose your contacts with the session world. Somebody will step in, and you'll be out, struggling again." It's understandable. Session was a really sort of well-respected job, and especially a rock guitarist being, the first person that wants a rock guitarist to ring him up. So he and Jim Sullivan were the two faces in rock guitar at that time.
What were your impressions of people like Eric Clapton in those days?
Well, the first time I heard him was on that 5 Live Yardbirds album, that Jim played me, and I was so thrilled with it. And I just thought, well, how the hell can I keep up with this, you know? Because I'd only just made up my mind that blues was for me, and not so much this pop rock that was Beatlesified, you know. I couldn't stand that stuff. Freddie and the Dreamers and all that junk.
So in some ways, when you were offered this rather smart Italian black suit, you must have been a bit
camel colour.
worried about it.
I was terrified. They had my hair off. It was really serious. The first day I signed with them, they had me around some dreadful Italian hairdresser, and off came the hair, and I felt like a thug. It was crew cut and terrible. They wanted me to look like Eric, even if I didn't play like it. And I felt, actually, after about a week, I felt a whole lot better for having it off. But
Well, you joined the band just as one of the first singles that made it for them, For Your Love, was released.
It was too easy. I felt a bit of a cheat, really, because the record it had hit written all over it, and Eric knew that, and the whole business was buzzing about this record, and that was part of the reason why Eric left, because he could see the Yardbirds heading in a very commercial direction, and he was heavily into blues at that time, and he could see that he was on a loser, really, from that point. He had to get playing blues, otherwise he might be on television singing For Your Love, and he didn't want that.
But you did play with him on stage, didn't you?
No, never.
Never. So, I mean, you actually replaced him.
That's right, yeah. We had about a week's rehearsal every day at the Marquee. Then that was pretty easy too, because we left the gear set up at the rehearsal and played in the evening, so I felt right at home.
Mm-hmm.
Played Beck's Boogie and got a standing ovation, and that was the end of it.
Of course, he went on to John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, and really, as you say, confirmed his idea of doing blues.
Yes, that's right.
You say it was sometime after?
Yeah, I don't think it happened till maybe 6 months after. That was a long time in the span of a pop band.
What do you think of For Your Love as a song? It was written by Graham Gouldman, who was, the old Mindbenders originally, wasn't
I quite liked it. It could have been a whole lot worse, you know. I mean, when they said, you know, we're going to make a pop record, I went, oh dear, I just couldn't handle all that. But then when I heard it, it seemed a bit bizarre. I had to get used to the idea that I was playing 12-string in place of the harpsichord, which was on the introduction of the record. So it all felt really strange, you know, trying to emulate the sound of a harpsichord on a 12-string. But it was more what I was after, you know, creating different sounds on the guitar.
A bit later in the summer, you released another single, which was when you were properly in the band, called Heartful of Soul.
Yeah. That's right. Well, we had Heartful of Soul cut almost immediately. I joined the band. In fact, I think it was cut before the release of For Your Love. I couldn't understand what was going on. Every day I was doing something different with them. And I remember Bill Ralph, Keith Ralph's father, coming in, beaming all over his face, which never happened. And he said, it's in the charts, it's in the charts. And I was delighted in one way, because the band was going to be lifted off the ground, but I wasn't on the record. So I felt, oh dear, you know, I have to explain this away, chaps.
Because in those days, if you released a hit single, you had to follow it up pretty quickly, because the charts changed so quickly, didn't they?
Not quite as quickly as they do now, I don't think.
What was it like to play in the Yardbirds in the first 6 months? Did you do lots of gigs, lots of appearances?
I was like the most incredible schoolboy trip of all time. I mean, you stay in hotels and you had no mum and dad breathing down your neck. It was terrific. No, I didn't want to go home. Once I got the taste of it, staying on these big Midland hotels and things, I loved it.
You hadn't toured America at that point, had you?
No. That was coming. We knew that was in the breeze, but Giorgio did a reconnoitring of the States. He went over there just to check it out and came back with T-shirts and this, that and the other and contracts and stuff. And we knew that we'd probably be going later on that year, 65.
Something that happened to the Yardbirds songs halfway through 65, when you released Heartful of Soul, was you released Evil Hearted You and Still I'm Sad, which was a double A side.
That's right.
And there were psychedelic songs in a way, weren't they? Very much like a lot of the other pop singles.
Yes, a lot of that was it started to gel. All the creativity started to gel in quite an exciting way. I mean, a Gregorian chant, but I think that's where they fell down a bit, because once they'd done a record like that, which was a really good record, how do you top a Gregorian chant? You know, I mean, you have to be that much different again, and there just wasn't it wasn't possible to be that much different on demand. You know,
Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds because of that direction musically. I mean, he didn't like the poppy singles, did he?
But that was the weird thing, because we weren't trying to be poppy. We were trying to do different styles of just anything and everything, Indian and flavour and Gregorian chants, which probably annoyed Eric, I should imagine, because he probably thought we were going to do Dave Clark 5 stuff and Rolling Stones type stuff.
But you felt quite comfortable about it yourself?
Oh yeah, because I was actively involved in the construction of the records.
Then Shapes of Things came out, which was the end of '65, wasn't it?
Bit in there. You know, I had the Indian raga solo in the middle with a sort of a sitar style guitar.
Some of the songs that you did, like you said, Beck's Boogie, which was one of the old chestnuts, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was a complete showcase of all the flashy licks that I'd learned, and it was great because there was no messing with it. You know, you could just get. If Jim, the drummer, and the bass player had fallen asleep, I could have carried on playing, because it's self-accompanied. There's a rhythm pattern and then a solo pattern and a rhythm pattern. In fact, it would have been more impressive without the band, really.
It was almost standard practice in those days as well for the guitarist to have a lead break, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You do a 3-minute encore piece on your own, and the band, as you say, could literally go to sleep if they wanted to.
Yes, but it was a bit worrying because we were still 12-bar then. You know, it was really strange because a lot of the repertoire was 12-bar blues. Then there'd be a thing like For Your Love, which was nothing like a 12-bar. You know, then Heart Full of Soul, and they weren't really the standard Chicago 12-bar blues. And so people didn't really know what the hell we were all about, really.
You mentioned that you were in hotels and travelling around a lot. Had you at that point moved into London, or were you still living in the south of England?
I was living at home with my mum and dad, and just, you know, it was just a sort of small house in Wallington, suburbia. Yeah.
Swept along a lot by the stardom and success of the Yardbirds.
Well, I mean, your mum and dad think that you're a loser and a waster and all the rest of it, not getting a proper job, and then they see you on TV and they think you're the most wonderful thing that ever walked.
Well, as I say, in early '66, Shapes of Things came out, which perhaps one of the most successful songs that you released.
That's when America came in the picture. We'd gone there, and they did. For Your Love was quite big, because that was obvious. I mean, that could be an international hit. But Shapes of Things was a little bit, you know, non-teeny bop.
A bit downbeat, wasn't it?
Yeah. A bit sort of heavy lyrics as well, you know, double, you know, whatever meanings.
What was the US tour like? First time for the Yardbirds?
Amazing, absolutely
You'd never
amazing.
been there before, had you?
No, it was all too quick for me. I couldn't, you know, I wanted to go there on a holiday to see what I was looking at, but that was out of the window, and we couldn't do that. We had to just take in the place as we were touring.
How was that tour organised? Did you have any problems?
Very bad. It was probably not much different to the 50s style rock tours, because there was no big promoters, so to speak. And, I mean, there was no road managers, hardly any. We'd carry the gear ourselves, you know. One roadie would do all the gear.
Of course, these days, an American tour is a very organised affair. Groups don't go over unless they know they're going to do a certain amount of cities and a certain size of audience.
The Yardbirds were pioneers in that sense, very much so. I mean,
you were really the beginning of the British invasion.
Yeah.
Of the 60s.
Of experimental psychedelic sort of music.
Do you remember any experiences that you had, perhaps in the West Coast, for example?
Where we got asked to play at a party because they knew we weren't going to play the proper gig. Yeah, it was great fun.
Why was that? Why weren't you allowed to play the gig?
There was a lot of red tape. You had to have a visa and a pass and all sorts of a blood sample and a piece of skin from the back of the neck. No, it was pretty heavy, trying to get clearance on each of these dates. And Giorgio said, "I'm afraid there's nothing for it. We've got to organise a little party somewhere." And we met this character called Kim Fowley, who's an infamous party organiser, and that was one of the best things I can ever remember doing, because people didn't have to pay money, and it was just music and fun and people. It was just great.
Of course, we called our underground scene after people like the Pink Floyd, but that was much later, really. That was the end of the 60s, and yet you were doing something that was very underground, going and playing.
It was so underground, nobody heard of it.
What was the reaction to Americans? Because here you were, white man's blues in some ways, and yet they'd had a tradition of black Chicago blues people like Muddy Waters for years.
But you'd get these sort of chewing gum type girls jumping up and down because of the image. But the irony of it is they were listening to their own music, you know, their own sort of culture. And then we came to Chicago, and that's when we found out what was going on, you know, because there was a Chicago blues club there, and we found we were playing on the same stage as Muddy Waters had been playing, and that's what we really wanted. But outside the boundary of Chicago, it wasn't really accepted. You know, you get these sort of students coming up and say, "Yeah, man, you're into Otis Rush, Otis," and we were getting accepted by the blues fanatics over there, which is great.
Also, equally, what must have been strange for Americans seeing you come over was that they'd had the whole Liverpool scene just before you.
Oh, yeah,
only a couple of
that was
years
a standard
beforehand.
question. Do you guys know the Beatles? You know, and we said no.
And not
really.
just the Beatles, there was Freddie and the Dreamers, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the
That's
Mersey
right.
Beats, the whole Cilla Black. I mean, they were all doing
That's right.
almost review tours. There'd be 5 or 6
Package tours.
That's
That's right.
And you actually did some of those sorts of tours, didn't you?
I did half of one, the Dick Clark package tour, and if I ever see Dick Clark, I'm going to punch him right on the nose. He put us in this stinking old coach.
You said it a bit lower.
And they'd never told us we'd be doing 600-mile drives and then playing in a terrible gig. I mean, there were dreadful conditions.
And you literally only had 25, 30 minutes sometimes.
Yeah.
And if it took you
It was
too long to
embarrassing.
set up, you
You lost your 2 numbers or whatever it was.
But you must have learnt a lot then. I mean, you must have learnt to be much more efficient at getting those numbers organised and going from one number to the other without too much setting up.
That's right. We were very annoyed that we couldn't get settled. I mean, just as soon as you get your first bead of sweat, you're off. And you're thinking, wow. And then on goes Johnny Tillotson or somebody. I mean, it was really awful, those short package tours. We were just waiting for the day when we could play a full 40-minute set or hour set, which we did later on.
When did that happen? Was that some years later, or was that just the next time you went?
It was LA which took us under their wing. You know, the KRLA radio started playing tapes that weren't released. I mean, people started making bootlegs on the radio and stuff of rare tapes, and we began to cause this real stir. You know, without any press, and that's what we played on. No press, and you just got to go and see these guys. You know, and we played the Hollywood Palladium. And it was packed for 3 nights, solid, standing room only. We just knew that something was going on there. And then the Dick Clark tour came after that. And I left. I just couldn't handle the strain of it.
Looking on from the time the Yardbirds went out and in a way pioneered the concert circuit for British bands, or European bands in general. Now, a group like Cream went out there and they were big from the very first day, weren't they? They did Madison Square Garden.
It was very astute planning. I think whoever was handling them knew exactly the zones, you know, to stick
you were
the pin.
almost guinea pigs then, weren't you? You taught the industry a lesson about how to organise tours.
Yeah, absolutely. And because of certain press that leaked out about Eric Clapton, they wanted to know who was on what record. You know, who was Jeff playing on For Your Love Note? Well, who was on the Heart for Soul? It was Jeff. Oh, so this started this great thing. So Eric was another face they all wanted to see. And whoever set up that promo tour, I mean, was genius. Because, like you say, they didn't have any messing about. Straight in the Whiskey A Go-Go, and they were there doing encores for the whole night. And then asked back at double the money, and then Chicago. Then they did a tour with The Who, which really broke the cream then.
You say that people always inquired as to who the guitarist was on each of the tracks or specific tracks of the Yardbirds. There's always been this interest in the Yardbirds, and that's why this interview's taking place today. Years later, although the band have disbanded and gone their ways, many of the musicians in the Yardbirds aren't even playing professionally now. The Americans still are interested in the phenomena. Why?
I think it's because they're just born to delve back into their heritage and find out. And it's like Japan. They've started asking who was on what record, and they just obviously, when they're at a certain age, certain sounds catch their ear. And like I was impressed with Scotty Moore. I mean, I just had to know who he was and where he lived, and who took over from him, James Byrne. And okay, so now I know all about James Byrne, and so it goes on. You just get fanatical about these people.
You think that you were interested in American musicians as much as perhaps Americans are interested in British musicians for the same reason.
Yeah.
Well, coming back from the American tour in 1966, you released Over Under Sideways Down. Was that particularly good for you? That song?
No, I if you listen to that record, there's a kind of Eddie Cochran bass slapping sound in it, which was a bit of 50s rock creeping back in. Even then, it was like my attempt at revival of that kind of, because everybody was playing smooth and very Motown-y type bass, but without that aggression. So that record had that, but I didn't really like it. It was too much of a jumble, and the words didn't the melody was non-existent. I started losing interest in. I lost faith in their what's the word? Judgment on what should be put out as a pop record. We should have stayed away instead of kind of come out and deliver on cue, you know.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the songwriting then? Did you play a big part in the
Well, that's
songwriting?
another thing. It's a bit naughty to say it, but I wasn't very good at writing lyrics. I still couldn't write 2 lyrics that made sense. And the rest of the lads in the band realised that publishing was a hot tip, and to write a silly melody and a few lyrics, you could tie up the whole business. Doesn't matter how many great guitar solos you do, if you don't get the... And I just didn't like the idea that I was being rode out of that side of it. And that's really what starts a lot of arguments going. Somebody puts a nice bit of icing on the cake, which makes it the record sometimes, and then you're not entitled to the writing royalty on it.
Well, more group changes took place after that album. Paul Samuel Smith left. Yeah. Why was that?
He always wanted to be Phil Spector. He used to wear the same hat, and he was very impressed with Phil Spector's work with the Righteous Brothers. And it's quite understandable that you'd want to try and find out how Phil Spector did that great sound. And aside from that, he wanted to produce folk music, I believe. People like, he was into Bob Dylan really quite heavily. And I think he found a way of staying in the music business without touring, which is a very good way to... Like, you can meet hundreds of people, hear all their music, without going outside a single door, you know.
Again, modern musicians, now, history's been written as far as touring's concerned, but when the Yardbirds were together, they were making history, learning to get on buses and planes and be in different cities every night. Nowadays, if a group goes on tour, they know exactly what's ahead of them.
Yes, that's right. Well, it was just a great pioneer feeling. You thought, hey, where are we going tonight? Are we going to get there even? You know, I mean, where's the gig? I mean, it was all part of the crazy world that it was then, and it was all, it ran parallel, the lunacy.
Well, it'd been about a year by the point that Paul had left. You'd been in the band a year, so you'd obviously got to know Keith Ralph, Jim McCarty, the other members of the group. How did you get on? Did you socialise outside of the group?
Well, I was pretty unbalanced then, and very fiery-tempered, and they weren't. They were very cynical and calm and collected, and I was just... They kept me in line a lot of the time. I'd throw the most dreadful, moody and swear, and they'd laugh at me. And I had no choice but to just swallow. But it was Giorgio that upset me, because I started sussing out what was going on management-wise and all that. And I alerted the rest of them, and they were prepared to sit back and take it because they liked the way things were going. And I didn't like the way things were going.
Well, another major change that went on, Paul left and Jimmy Page came in. Now, he'd been in the background for a while anyway. I mean, he'd been approached, hadn't he? Yes.
Giorgio had approached him because he was the obvious choice. He was a wizard on the guitar. And they for some reason, they had to have a guitarist. I thought that was a strange thing because you could have had a guy playing the violin. I mean, why the guitar all the time? But that they were right in pushing to get a good guitar.
Perhaps.
Yeah. But no, they wanted a wizard on the guitar. They had to have that. And Jim was the obvious choice. And they were horrified when he turned it down. They were so sure. It's like the football teams. If you get a wizard of 16 and turning around and saying, no, thank you, I'm not interested. They couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle it. And
but he did
eventually, Simon Napier Bell took over management, and for some reason, Jim gave in to him where he wouldn't give in to Giorgio. So we sat in an Indian restaurant somewhere in London, and I actually witnessed Jimmy cracking up and saying, yes, I will join. And I went, oh, right. Because he was a real close friend at that time.
Did you feel insecure or that perhaps what had been your little post, if you like, as the lead guitarist was threatened in any way?
No, at all. I was delighted that he joined because we used to get on so well. I mean, the telepathy was there and humour, and just a good buddy. And I thought, well, even if we do fight over the guitar a bit, it's still going to be... There's 99 9/10 of the time you're not playing anyway. You just get on well. Surely we can sort out that other fraction, And we did. We got some nice double lead things going. Furious guitars going on. And that's where the psychedelic guitar style comes from. That manic dual guitar where all blowing away, and this is gorgeous, ghastly noise to some. You know.
Happenings 10 years ago was a song that you released at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't really too up on all this sort of drug stuff. I mean, I never taken drugs, ever. Nothing that would hallucinate, and I think Keith did. I think these lyrics showed that he did that, but I couldn't understand a lot of what he was driving at with his lyrics. He's a very inward person. And I just wanted a good excuse to have a charge about on stage and play the way I could play. I didn't care what the songs were about.
Didn't you think you were being unfashionable? Because everyone seemed to take drugs in those days. All the songs and
No, I was
singles were...
terrified
I mean,
of
even
that.
the Hollies, who were very straight, had singles out that were related to drug taking.
I know. Drugs frightened me because I'd never seen a good advertisement for them. You know, everybody I looked at looked idiots, and they're all sort of... That whole 60s Chelsea thing made me sick. I couldn't stand it. I used to, you know, Mick Green, who's the guitarist with Freddie Starr, I mean, he and I used to think a lot the same. And when I hear his point of view on drugs, I just could never take them on the strength of that alone.
Well, you were ill at one point after Happenings 10 years ago, and at that point, Jimmy Page took over on lead guitar.
That's right, and it was all a bit funny because I didn't know if he was secretly delighted that I'd gone, or whether he didn't want the rather sort of heavy-duty responsibility of trying to fill my shoes at that time. But they went to Australia, and I'm afraid Jim got a bad time from the Aussie fans because the tour had been long awaited, and they were fortunately, well, at that time I was being plugged a lot, more than probably Keith was. And when the old Jimmy turned up and I wasn't there, it was pretty bad. So it must have had a bad effect on him. His first tour as him on lead guitar, sort of thing.
That seemed to be the height of the Yardbirds' fame about that time, and then it started to wane, didn't it?
I think it was because Samuel Smith wasn't there, and although he was a bit aloof from rock and roll, he still had some pretty cute ideas. And without him, and with Keith going down the pan with alcohol, which he was, and Jim not really knowing what the hell was going on, he had to pick up a few loose ends, and it wasn't working. Management was a bit crumbly then. And it's just add all the things together and you got disaster.
From what you're saying, it seems like you were the casualty of what went on for a lot of groups in those days, and yet people like The Who and the Rolling Stones have survived it through the years, although both of those groups respectively have lost musicians. Keith Moon, Brian Jones.
You have to have a nucleus, a good solid song to keep a band together, I think, and you've got to enjoy. Everybody's got to like playing it, I think, and it's got to be successful. It's no use having a load of great songs and nobody likes them. Those things. If you've got those factors there, I think you're halfway there to keeping a band together.
You said that Jimmy went off with the Yardbirds and he was the lead man for the Australian tour and had a bit of a hard time. Were you out of the group completely at that point?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, when I knew they were going to Australia. And they finished off the tail end of an American tour, the Dick Clark tour, which I mentioned earlier. And I desperately wanted to see Jim to say, I'm sorry about lumbering you like this. And then I found out he was quite happy, you know. Then he wasn't too happy when he came back from Australia. The reports were bad. And then they started playing gigs in England, and I went along to see him, and it was pretty bad. They didn't even have the Fire playing the old early sort of I'm a Man type records.
That's it for this edition of the Rock Podcast. If you're listening to the audio-only version, I want you to know we have a video version on YouTube. It's all free, no charge. As always, thanks for joining us and helping us become the #1 podcast in classic rock. Find us at our website, therockpodcast.com, and send your comments, questions, and suggestions to me at hello@therockpodcast.com. That's hello@therockpodcast.com. Thanks, and I look forward to the next episode.